My name is Dake. This is my compatriot Mike Moulckers, and today we're going to talk to you about the InterSystems Cloud Manager. So you guys are all in the right room, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the cloud, a little bit about containers, and then I'm going to get right into talking about the Cloud Manager. Now, as part of this, you're going to see me start the demonstration pretty much when I first start talking about the InterSystems Cloud Manager. And the reason is going to be because no matter what cloud you're talking to, whichever one you're provisioning, it does take a little bit of time. And my timing this morning says the first step is going to take about 4 minutes. So I'm going to start it when I start the Cloud Manager. We'll see what happens, and we'll take it steps through and talk through and see what actually occurred as part of the process. How many of you have actually been in a container class today or over the course of this week? Excellent. So let's talk about a little bit about cloud computing, right? You know, the whole word cloud originally came because people were trying to describe the internet, and they'd say it connects to the internet, and they didn't know how to draw the internet, so they kind of drew a cloud. And then when all these things, the advancement in processors, cheap servers, virtualization, distributed management, all that started to come together, and now you could have what we call the cloud. And whether that's, Amazon, Azure, Google, it's all led to the success of hosted software. Now, you had software as a service before, but often you had to go and you had to connect to a VPN, or if you went way back, you might have had to dial up, heaven forbid. But now, you got ubiquitous network access all over, and you have these companies that provide cloud services. And what does that give you? Well, we talked about network access, but it means that you can get to it anytime, anywhere, any device. And it's very elastic. You can use what you need. You need some more, you add some more. You need less, you add less. And from a finance perspective, you're paying as you go, right? You only pay for what you use. And that's kind of led to this whole variety of service modes on the cloud, right? So you have software as a service, you have platform as a service, you have infrastructure as a service. And think about that last one, infrastructure as a service, because we're going to come back to that. Because when you look at what happens inside the InterSystems Cloud Manager, effectively, infrastructure as a service, infrastructure as code. You're going to write code, you're going to write commands that effectively give you your infrastructure. And if you look at the various cloud computing systems, you look at that outer ring, that's infrastructure. So it's what you're going to rent. You're going to rent compute time, you're going to rent storage time, you're going to rent network time. And that's all the basic cloud services, that we've talked about. And then platform as service is really the tools you use to build something on those clouds. And you can talk about the Google App Engine or AWS Elastic Beanstalk or something like that. So those are also ready to rent, and those are the tools that you use. But you get to this top layer. Think of this as a tiered wedding cake. It's a lot easier to look at. You're looking down on the cake. Software as a service, right? I bet every one of us use one of these every day of the week, whether it's Salesforce or Workday or Concur, GoToMeeting. We all use those kind of applications all day long. Most of you know a lot about containers now because you've attended some of the classes, so I'm going to be very brief about this. The whole point of a container is to package your application up with all the dependencies and be able to run it in a light format that is going to be able to move across platforms. And it has a lot of advantages. One of the things from a technical standpoint it kind of forces you to do is to separate your code and your data. How many of you in your own I come from a background of monolithic applications, right? I'm betting most of you have done a lot of those. How many times in your own application have you wanted to say, gosh, I want to go back and I want to separate my code and my data because it's going to make my life easier? It really does, and containers help you actually do that in the sense that by doing that, now you have your data storage outside, your code in the container. So containers have these wonderful characteristics. They're stable, they're efficient. they're an immutable architecture, right? If you're going to fix a container, if something goes wrong in a container, right, you have two choices, right? You can restart the container. Okay, that's one choice. But from a standpoint of fixing it, what do? You go all the way back to that first step, and you fix the container, and then deploy it through your QA, your tests, and eventually to your prod. But you're moving the whole container. And that's that basic pipeline process. One wonderful thing about containers is they're fast. They take very little time to start up. And the reason is why. Look at this comparison between virtual machines and containers. I like this slide because it gives you a good example. In a virtual machine world, every time you boot a virtual machine, it's going to take you a couple of minutes, and you have a complete guest OS running on top of the hypervisor. But in the case of a container, what you have is you have only the app and the specific binaries or libraries you need to run that app, and it gets the rest of its services you need from the host OS. So the net result of that is an average container size is only megabytes versus a virtual machine, which is often gigabytes. They're less resource intensive. You can run more containers on any given platform than you could virtual machines. That gives you a lot more options, makes them more cost effective, right? So you can do more things on the same platform, whatever you're paying for. It's much easier to track bugs. It's much easier to, they're less complicated because, again, you have this immutable architecture. You know it's the same thing every time you move it through, as opposed to what I certainly have done and what I suspect most of you have done. You have a DBA, you have someone, maybe it's yourself, who's had to go through and make sure the machine is configured with all the libraries and everything you want all the way through the process. So, and you've all heard this week, we're going to be producing our own containers. Now, you could go out and you could take Cache Ensemble and the InterSystems IaaS data platform, and you could build your own separate container. But a much better way is to use our pre-built containers. Our pre-built containers will have everything all set up in them, and then all you do is configure them. And this is a standard way a lot of code is delivered in this world. We're going to continue talking about this continuous integration, this DevOps world. So now we're going to talk about the InterSystems Cloud Manager. And before I do that, I'm going to switch over here to the demo, and we're going to start the first part of this. So let me show you what you're looking at here. How many of you have done the cloud experience in the ISC learning? Okay, so this will be familiar to you. For those of you who have not seen this, what we have is, this is an example of the InterSystems Cloud experience in online learning services. The bottom half is obviously a command line, right? And it's actually inside a container. So the first thing to remember about the Cloud Manager is it is in a container. It's delivered in a container. On your left-hand side is really representative of what the directory tree is in that container. And you can see up on that left-hand side how the fact there is something for Amazon. There's a directory for Amazon and Azure. We're going to be using Google today. So that's GCP, and there's a few other directories in there. But the important thing to realize is you're actually talking to a container. It's got Linux in it, so it's just like using Linux. On the right-hand side is you have whatever the contents of that, flush this here. Whatever the contents of that directory is, and in this case, we have a number of files that we're going to go back and talk about a little bit. The first one is a default file, right? It describes how we connect to Google, what directories you use, what the passwords are, what the ports are going to be, what images to use out there. And there's the same kind of definition file for all of these. The second thing you'll see that's interesting in here is a very simple JSON file. And what does it do? It says, I want to provision a couple different types of systems. I've given mine a label, Dake demo, and I say what their role is, where to get the license key, Very important for us InterSystems folks. And how many of them I am going to actually provision. On the top one, I'm going to provision one system, and this bottom one, I'm going to provision two. So in the course of time, what you're going to see is we're going to actually provision 3 systems out on Google Cloud here. So the first command, and I'm going to start this, and you're going to see it's going to take a few minutes, so we'll go back to the PowerPoint. ICM provision. I'm telling the cloud manager, go out and provision the nodes that I've described out on Google. So it's starting. We're going to come back to it in a second. Okay. So let's talk about the cloud manager while it's doing its thing. So what is it? It's a simplified, containerized way of abstracting your storage, right? And a tool to manipulate and use it. It uses JSON definitions, like we just saw, to tell it what to do. So again, back to the concept of infrastructure as code. You define it in code, and the system goes out and does it. And I'll explain how we do it. But it's all part of this continuous lifecycle process. How many of you have heard from either your manager or gone to classes on DevOps or continuous integration? Those are getting to be pretty common words. We'll talk about those a little bit down the road here. So what does it combine? It combines a couple of elements. First of all, plain text configuration files. I'm sure all of you looked at those files and said, yeah, I can do that. No problem. Second, it's a command line interface, right? All of us have done that before. That's no problem. And one of the benefits of having that command line interface is the fact that you actually now can easily script a command line interface. I bet most of you in here at some point in your lives have had to use a shell script down on the operating system layer, or at some other point to do a bunch of things as you make your application work, and that's why we left it as a command line interface. It works with all the common infrastructure providers like Google and Amazon, and you're going to be able to provision, take containers that you have built, maybe starting with the InterSystems versions of those containers. You've configured, you've added your application, you've done other things to them now, so the way you want. Now you can put those containers out on the nodes that you've provisioned out in the cloud, and the system does that for you, and it gives you a lot of tools to monitor and manipulate, and we will demonstrate and show you some of those in a minute. So how does it all put together? Well, first of all, we start with Terraform. Terraform is a tool that has APIs into all the major players, right? Google, Amazon, Azure, and vSphere. We're going to talk some more about vSphere and a little bit about legacy, because you can actually provision systems into your vSphere, VMware clouds if you have them internally. You can also provision legacy systems out there. We use JSON files. We talked about that a little bit. We use a smattering of Java in there to give us some multi-threading. And then it says pre-configured service artifact. It's a container. That's what they call it. And then, of course, that consistent command line interface. We talked about what it supports over there in the cloud infrastructure, but what is it going to do for you, okay? Well, in the demo, we actually put out a shard master. We also put out 2 shard workers. But you can also, there's configurations in there for query servers, for ECP configurations, and for mirroring configurations. How many of you have had to configure mirrors? Anybody? Okay. Well, you know that mirrors are not hard to configure, but they can be tedious to configure. And having something that knows how, because we've actually done the templates for it, you can actually provision those systems pre-configured for mirrors out in the cloud. So I personally think that's really, really good. This slide essentially repeats what we've talked about, basically taking those JSON definitions and putting them out in the specific cloud, and then running commands like this here, which you will see when we get back to the rest of the demo. And I think we could go on from that. So one of the interesting things that comes from this architecture is the fact that you really have 3 levels of, if you will, system to deal with, right? You have the compute node itself, you have the container itself, and then of course you have Cache Ensemble, the InterSystems Iris Data Platform that you can all talk to, and I'm going to demonstrate that in a minute. So what makes it valuable? Okay, first of all, it plays nicely in the field. It's something that your managers, your architects, they all want to build things in the cloud, but there's a lot of details to that. This makes some of those details easier, specifically when you're deploying and provisioning. That's what this thing does for you, for the most part. Again, part of the continuous integration cycle, a couple of specific use cases, and then we're going to talk about legacy systems. It's cloud native mantra. It's part of what is to be expected in new systems these days. Software-defined everything. We talked about software-defined architecture. We've talked about infrastructure. Now we're talking about networks and storage. And all of that together means that you define it once and you get the same thing every time you deploy it. If you were to look at the continuous integration and delivery cycle, right? Where you fix something or you build something at the very front here, you eventually put it in a container, you move the container forward to do your testing and into the registry and out to deploy it into production. Where does the InterSystems Cloud Manager play in this cycle? It plays right here at the end, where you're actually deploying those containers, deploying compute nodes out into the world. I kind of like this slide because it gives a great example. Most of us here, how many of you have actually configured a system out on one of the clouds? Okay, so again, it's like mirroring. It's not hard, but it can be tedious. And if you have 1 or 2 systems, like on the left-hand side, 3 systems, whatever, you can do that. It might take you a while. You might have to be careful you do it the same way every time, but you can do that. But when you get to the system here on the right-hand side, a lot more complicated, because now you have mirroring, application servers, load servers, and there's a template that'll just deploy this system here on the right-hand side. All you have to do is configure how many nodes you need, what operating systems you want it on, that kind of thing. So to me, this is, obviously it's valuable for the use case of sharding, because when you go out and you're starting to build a sharded system, how many of you have gone to the sharding presentations? So I'm not going to go into an explanation of sharding. If you want to come up later, we'll talk about it. But essentially, you choose how many ways you split your data, right? How many systems you want to put it out on. So being able to deploy a system like that quickly and easily and take advantage of commodity hardware out in the cloud manager makes that a simpler task. And then, of course, we've got, every one of us has a legacy solution. Typically, it's a monolithic solution. Maybe it has 1, 2, or 3 tiers in it, but now you want to put that out in the cloud. So you can still use the cloud manager to deploy that system. It'll deploy the compute nodes. It sets up the, and you'll see this when we look back at the demonstration. It sets up secure communications with SSH. It sets up Weave to collect information and allow you to do some of that communication. And it supports moving entire directories out into the cloud. So you can move your legacy application out into the cloud with this product. So let's get back to the demonstration. See if my fingers work this time. All right, we're done. So a couple of things. Let's see what happened here. All right, can everybody read what's on the screen here fairly well? All right. So it starts provisioning the compute nodes according to what I've defined. So we're building a couple of systems out there. We're copying files out there. We set up a SSH connection. And notice that we test to see if it succeeded, that connection. That's an important point, because when you're deploying things out in the cloud, it's not necessarily going to come up at the same speed. One of those nodes might come up more slowly than the other nodes. So there's a lot of retry logic that's actually built into the Cloud Manager for various parts of this, and you'll see it more later. You'll notice up there in the SSH connection it says attempt 1 of 60. I am here to tell you I have seen it attempt 47 times. Sometimes it just takes a while depending on what's going on in that particular cloud at that time. So it goes out and configures them, it copies some more files, it mounts volumes because the persistence is outside, right? We're going to go install Docker. All our containers are based on Docker. Docker is kind of ubiquitous. I'm thinking all you guys know that at this point. But what do? We go out and we make sure that Docker is available on those compute nodes. We install WeaveNet. That gives us some configuration information. And then at the very end, it actually runs this inventory. So it shows you the IP addresses of all the machines and the DNS name to show you what you've actually configured and built. And it gives you a command how to take it all apart, right? Unprovision. This will take it all down. And if you ever need to go back and see what happens here, you can actually go back and there's a complete log of whatever happens. So you can see the entire contents and go back and look and see what time it happened and everything. So let's give a couple quick examples here. So it shows an inventory, but I'm going to show you the command to run the inventory. We should get pretty much the same thing. And we do. And now we want to see, we need to run this little shell script, docker login.sh, and that's going to allow us to log into Docker because when we put the containers out there, we want Docker aware of us. So we're going to run that real quick. Shouldn't take too long. There we go. And now I'm going to say ICM run. And what ICM run is going to do, it's going to deploy the containers. Let's see, where am I here? Oh, there. So in our defaults file, right up here, right here, you see where it says Docker image? That's how it knows which image to put out there. And so when I type ISC run down here, it's going to use that information to go ahead and put the containers out on the systems. So when I ran this morning, it took 2 minutes and 49 seconds. We'll hope that it takes less. It may take a hair more. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. So this slide is kind of my tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, and then tell them what you're going to tell them what you want to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. This is my tell them what you told them slide. I always get that confused. But essentially, this is the important things to come away with. So the Cloud Manager runs in a container. It'll provision compute nodes, and it deploys containers itself. It uses JSON text files to configure. It has pre-built, and this is an important point, pre-built definitions for mirrors and clusters. And it can deploy those sharded systems based on those templates. You can change those templates. You can make those templates different. You can make your containers different. You can change up pretty much everything on here in some fashion. It has software in here we'll show you in a minute after the containers are deployed so that you can communicate with all these systems. And then at the end, it'll unprovision that system. So that takes it apart, takes it out of the cloud so you can not spend any more money where you don't want to. And why would you want to do that? So if you think about it, part of using the cloud is deciding where your software is going to run most effective from a dollars and cents business standpoint and also most effective from a technical standpoint. And all the clouds have different characteristics, and you want to test that. So you might want to deploy your system and do a couple of QA runs and QA tests out on each one of the different clouds. Well, if you've done software definitions, right, if you've built your infrastructure as code, that makes it pretty easy to do. And of course, once you run that test, you don't want to spend any more money out there, so you want to take it apart. And that's what the unprovisioned command. And remember, we got that unprovisioned command automatically in the log file after we had done the provision. So we can see out here that it's pulled in the images. It's creating some namespaces out there. It's enabling the shard service. And now we've got systems that are running out there. Here it gives me a management portal. And we can see that we actually have a running system out there. Okay? So let's see what the containers look like. So here I'm going to run through a couple of quick examples of commands you can run just to demonstrate some of the things that you can do from the Cloud Manager. And some of it I'm going to type, and some of it I've already put in the history because I'm a terrible typist. So if you want to see what containers are out there, you can type ICM PS -- container iris. So now it lists all the container images that are running out on the nodes that I've provisioned out there. We already know we have an inventory, but suppose we want to connect to one of those systems. Okay, suppose you want to go out and run a single command out on one system. This command says, go out and run an LS, show me the directory structure. Inside that directory, on all the systems that have the role of data master, there's only one. It's going to come back, and it's going to basically give me the directory contents of that one file. But maybe I just want a bash shell onto the compute node data master, right? Well, right now, I'm on that, the data master. I'm at root. I'll do a ls. I can do a ps. Remember, you're dealing with Linux all the time here, so if you know any Linux commands, they should work. And you can take that another step. And I can say, well, I want to connect to all machines that end with 3. There's only one of these here. And what am I going to get here? I'm going to get a cache shell here. Right? So set x equal 1, y equal 3. This is the simplest thing I could write. X plus y, write a $ZV, okay? So you can do everything that you want. You can pick the machines that you want to get to. Halt, I'm now back right in the same thing. If I go farther up here, this is an interesting command because it's going to run this cost command out there. Does the temp, it's basically saying does /temp exist. It's going to go out and run it on all the systems at once. And what's it do? It brings back the contents so you can look at them out here. That's what effectively happened. Okay. So there's a lot of other commands you can run to actually move things back and forth. But at the end of the day, you still want to unprovision that system. So there's a number of ways you can do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go find that system that we, in the log file, ICM.log, right? So we just have to go find it. There's our command right there. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go out and destroy the nodes that I just created. And one of the ways you're going to tell that it actually destroyed the nodes is in a minute, a few seconds, it's going to prompt for me. It's going to say, I can't no longer connect to that management portal that we set up there. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do with the InterSystems Cloud Manager. And there's actually a rationale for why. You notice we've been very careful all week about what words we use. It's the InterSystems Iris Data Platform, or InterSystems Iris, right? It's important we get the naming correct. InterSystems Cloud Manager, notice does not say Iris Cloud Manager. It's the InterSystems Cloud Manager because it will apply to all InterSystems products. It's outside that. It runs in its own container. And in fact, of course, that container has its own operating system, which is also Linux in there. So I think it's a really neat tool. I think for those of you, how many people are actually looking at cloud or have done cloud deployments in their corporations, in their businesses right now? You guys? What clouds have you used? Azure? Anybody else? Anything different? Azure's popular. vSphere? Yeah. So I think this is going to, there it is, finally. Can't get to the portal anymore. Having worked with this for the last few months, Mike and I have both come to the conclusion that it's so much easier to do this work with a tool like the InterSystems Cloud Manager. And I'll make one more comment, and that is, up until a few months ago, I didn't really understand or work with containers too much. But now, having worked with this and worked with some containers, I think there is a strong argument, if you haven't looked at containers, to take a look at them and see how it might benefit your application in terms of stability, in terms of moving code through, making it immutable. I'm totally destroyed now. So it's all gone away. So that's really all I have for you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Go for it.
So we're, Tyler, I go by Dake, American Cross Healthcare Insurance Company out of Washington State.
Okay.
Obviously, we're a regulated entity. We have ambitions to InterSystems certified. So what sort of certification are you providing with your containers? Or is that even something that you guys are looking at?
What was the certification that you needed? I didn't quite catch the acronym.
Also, HITRUST.
Oh, HITRUST, okay, sure.
Right, and I guess correlated to that would be, are these containers being hosted on the Amazon, HIPAA platform or anything like that? Or?
Not yet, but what we want them to, eventually we want to get there. I think we have to make sure we have our own internal processes sorted out. There's, legitimately there's an internal debate about whether we want to provide our own registry or whether we want to post them out on Docker or some of the other clouds. There hasn't been a decision made on that for sure yet. But I think having the certification for high trust is going to be important. I mean, one of our first clients that work with containers, and since you've heard that presentation, you've heard about Ontario, right? That's all debt collection. They do a lot of work with the government. So they're in those high trust situations. So I would be surprised if we don't do something. But I don't have any information that says any decisions have been made.
Well, our first deployment is going to be on our own virtual infrastructure as well, so probably looking like later next year or early 2019 or something like what you guys.
Okay, that's good information. I'll pass it back to Luca Ravizzola was in here a minute ago. Luca's the cloud manager. So I'll pass that back to Luca because I don't know if anybody's actually where their thought process is on that. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for being very patient and quiet. Practically the last presentation before lunch. If anybody has any questions or wants to talk to Mike or I, come on up and we'll go on. And by the way, I should make one introduction. He's going to hate it. Steve here in front. Steve put together. He built the cloud manager for us, and I think he's done a great job. So, thank you all very much.